Today is July 26th, 2024, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Before I get started with a talk for today, I'd like to just announce that my mother, those of you who listen to these talks and have listened for some time may know that in January of this year, my mother suffered a terrible stroke and was near death in the hospital after an unsuccessful surgery and was reduced to the state of a vegetable, really. I mean, she couldn't do anything. Well, today, 6 or so months later, she made her first trip back to church and attended Mass with us this morning. So I'd like to ask you to join me in giving thanks to God for my mother's recovery. She's still extremely limited in what she can do. She can hardly walk. She can hardly talk. She can't read. She's easily confused and distracted. But in her thinking, she is still able to make a priority out of getting to Mass. And today was the first time that she's been able to join us ever since she's had her stroke. So thanks be to God for His mercy on my mother and allowing her to recover and continue to recover. So I thank you for your prayers and ask you to please continue to pray for my mother, whose name is Lorraine. Yesterday, I posted a talk that would provide some help for us, something for us to think about and chew on as we enter into a new election season here in the United States. And I was prompted to do that by an email that I received from an Academy mother who was expressing her frustration and confusion as we enter the election season because it's so complicated. We can all tell that there's so much at risk, and we just don't have time to devote hours and hours a day to researching and learning about candidates and policies and platforms and all this stuff. And so we're tempted to say, I just forget it. I don't even want to bother with this. I don't want to be distracted by this. I don't even care. Don't want to vote, on and on. We're tempted to just say, leave me alone. I don't want to be bothered with this. I don't have time. And so we can't do that, obviously. We're given this right and privilege to vote. We're given this opportunity to contribute in a small but significant way to our government as Christians in a democratic society. And we need to at least make that an intelligent, a prudent influence that we have through voting. So what I did yesterday was I introduced an effort that the bishops here in the United States made a year ago, I think it was, to give some guidance through a number of documents that they published that were titled together, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. And we walked through an introductory handout or document that the bishops had published, and we looked at the parable of the Good Samaritan, which Pope Francis calls us to focus on as we consider our role in political activities. We talked about the Good Samaritan. We talked about the context of the parable of the Good Samaritan, the significance of that parable. So if you didn't get that first talk, I recommend you go back and look that one up. It's on the YouTube channel, published yesterday, July 25th, and it's titled Handling the Election Season Responsibly, Part 1. And today's message will be Part 2. So if you didn't get a chance to hear that one, go listen to that first, because I think it establishes a good context for what we're going to get into in this second discussion. So we were drawn to the parable of the Good Samaritan, and we were told that while the bishops can't give us specific direction with respect to individual candidates and policies and so on, because these things have concrete circumstances in our local elections, they can give us general principles, and then we as the laity are responsible to take those general principles, those Catholic principles, from the bishops and discuss them and reflect on them and consider how they apply to our unique circumstances. And the bishops identified a number of timeless principles of the role of the church in public life. Timeless principles. And these were listed as the infinite worth and dignity of every human life, the common good, solidarity, and subsidiarity. And we said if you don't know what those terms mean, it's okay, because the bishops published a number of documents to address each one of these things. And in these talks, I'd like to go through them. So we'll get their definitions, we'll understand what they are, see some examples and applications and so on. So just remember these topics: the infinite worth and dignity of every human life, the common good, solidarity, and subsidiarity. So we looked at the first document, the introduction, and I'm going to move on now to the second document. And the title of this second document that the bishops published is The Role of the Church in American Political Life. The Role of the Church in American Political Life. Now, one of the things that I want to note before we get into this, notice that this is a direct instruction from the bishops to Americans. The role of the church in American political life. And it's important for us to note that in America, we need to listen to and follow the counsel of our American bishops. One of the problems, one of the dangers, I guess I could say, in the Catholic faith is that we can start reading all sorts of books and sources on the Catholic life. We can read saints, we can read church fathers, we can read catechisms from different periods in church history. And there are general, timeless Catholic principles, Catholic dogmas, for example, that apply in all circumstances. But how they apply is left to the prudence of the bishops of the church and in some cases to us as lay individuals. So we've got to be careful when we read from church history that we keep these two things separate, that we keep separate timeless or Catholic principles and temporary or circumstantial applications of those principles, because the applications may not be the same in our circumstances. The principles will be the same, but the application may not be the same. And so we've got to be careful that when we read, let's say, the lives of the saints, we pay attention in their lives to the principles by which they live. But we don't allow ourselves to think that the details of the applications in their time, in their place, in their circumstances can necessarily be copied and pasted into our time and our place, our circumstances. So we've got to be careful to keep these two things distinguished. General principles or Catholic principles that guide our behavior in all times, in all places, and the specific, the unique, practical, concrete application of those principles in our own time and place. So we've got the bishops here, the United States bishops, writing in the 21st century, even in the present election cycle, giving us counsel as to how to participate conscientiously and faithfully in American political life. So that leads us to this second document, the role of the church in American political life. And this second document begins with another quote from Pope Francis. So let's read this. The church is the body of Christ, who reigns as king over all creation. The church is the body of Christ, who reigns as king over all creation. Everything, including political life, belongs to Jesus Christ. And so, participation in political life belongs to the mission of the church. Our mandate is to go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. Here, the creation refers to every aspect of human life. Nothing human can be alien to it. Again, that's from Pope Francis. Now, there we have the teaching that I believe as Catholics we all love. We all love the idea of the church as the body of Christ and Christ as the king over all creation, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And for most of us, that's the only government, that's the only kingdom, that's the only citizenship that we really care about. But because we live in the flesh, in time and space, and in God's providence, we live in America, we've got to deal with things on the ground here around us that can be very frustrating, irritating, distracting, and so on. And in this, we participate in a certain way in the incarnation of Christ. We imitate Christ, who thought this world was significant enough to enter into, to participate in faithfully, and to model the Christian life for us, to model all virtues for us. And throughout his life, we saw him at many different times submit himself to human institutions, human needs, and so on. And so if Christ was willing to subject himself to these things, it's ridiculous for us to think that we can despise them or excuse ourselves from them. How significant are they? They're significant enough that Christ himself participated in them. So we've got to think about how this universal truth of Christ being the Redeemer and King of the universe, of God being the creator of all things, how does this apply to our own time and space, to every aspect of human life? And Pope Francis says that this idea of every aspect of human life is signified by the term the creation. Go into the world and proclaim the good news, that is, preach the gospel to the whole creation. And obviously that is what we're struggling to understand. We're trying to learn to understand how exactly can we do that in American political life. So the bishops write the following. Our national tradition of religious freedom permits and encourages all people of faith to bring the insights of their religious traditions to bear on political matters. So freedom of religion doesn't mean freedom from religion. It doesn't mean atheism. It doesn't mean secularism or materialism or agnosticism. The freedom of religion means that those of us who hold to certain religious convictions, certain religious beliefs, and live according to principles of different religious systems of faith and morals, we're not to deny those religions. We're not to be quiet about those religions or hide them. keep them secret. We don't have to keep them in our homes, as it were. But we're encouraged by freedom of religion to bring our religious faith and morals into public discussion, into public political life. If we study American history, this is very clear. If we go back and study the Revolutionary War, for example, it's very interesting to see how many Americans were fleeing from the circumstances in Europe when they originally came to America. Puritans, for example, were trying to escape persecution from other Christian groups. There were a number of different Christian groups trying to get out of Europe and find a place where they could be free. And when we look at early colonial history in America, we see these different areas settled by different religious groups, like the Pennsylvania Quakers and the Puritans of New England. We have Presbyterians and Congregationalists in Princeton. We've got Anglicans in Virginia, and so on. We see different groups from Europe coming to America and settling into different areas. And so America was divided by its religious persuasions. And it was almost as if there were different cultures living on the American continent in the original colonies. Maryland, I should mention, Maryland was a Catholic colony. So when we look back into colonial history, we find this nation that really isn't unified as one nation. It's a division. It's a diversity of different religious groups settled in different areas, really living according to their own unique sets of faith and morals. And yet, these religious groups were forced to unify at the time of the Revolution. And it's worth noting that, in American early history, we learn about the Declaration of Independence, and we get this image that the King of England was governing the colonies, and then all of a sudden the colonies decided to band together and throw off the yoke of the King of England. And that's really not what happened. It's more complicated than that. There were other controversies going on in America. The English were fighting against other forces like the French and the Indians. And the English military, the British military, was also working to provide security as the King's army for the colonists in America, particularly of those who were English. And so the King of England demanded that the American colonists basically pay the costs of the war activities that his soldiers were engaged in. And when the American colonists said, we're not going to pay taxes and just give money to your soldiers over whom we have no influence or control. If you control them, if you're their king, well then, you need to support your own military activities. And so the King of England declared before the Declaration of Independence that he would no longer protect the American colonies. And when he withdrew his protection, that was when the American colonists published the Declaration of their independence, because they were going to have to defend themselves. And they were going to have to separate from this English rule and establish their own government so that they could collect taxes in the colonies, establish their own federal government, and raise and maintain their own army, their own military. So there was more complexity to the Revolutionary War than just Americans overthrowing the English government. There was no English government here in the colonies. They were separate states, separate colonies, separate groups, and they came together in order to protect themselves against outside threats. And that's always been one of the principal missions of the American government, to protect the American people from foreign invasion. So anyway, during the Revolutionary War, or before the Revolutionary War, I should say, we know that America was divided into different groups based on religious persuasions, and they were hostile to one another. Obviously, the Puritans up in New England wanted nothing to do with the Catholics in Maryland. And the Anglicans down in Virginia wanted nothing to do with Quakers in Pennsylvania or Puritans in Boston. They really didn't get along. They really couldn't get along. They were deeply divided according to religious persuasions. But when the revolution began, they were forced to seek the common good. They were forced to come together. And that's where we get this idea, this phrase, e pluribus unum, out from many came one. And these different groups of people, because of the pressing circumstances that they faced, they had to come together. They had to find ways to work together in order to seek the common good, and they did. And George Washington, if there's anything that he is to be praised and admired for, and he should be praised and admired by all Americans, if there's one thing that he should be praised and admired for, it was his ability to unite the people in the colonies and encourage them to respect one another and work together in order to overcome the dangers that they faced at that time. And if you get into the history of that period, you'll find many interesting stories about the different religious groups interacting with one another, collaborating together, learning about one another, and so on. And by the time that the war was over, by the time the Constitution was established in 1789, or I should say 1787, it was ratified in 1789, by the time leading men of the colonies put pen to paper and signed and ratified the Constitution, all of those different religious groups were represented in the signatures of those founding fathers, including several Catholics. And so the Revolutionary War brought the people of America together, and we see that in the signatures on the Constitution. At least two of them, I believe it was two, Daniel Carroll from Maryland and Thomas Fitzsimmons from Pennsylvania, were Catholics. And it's very interesting to see how the Catholics earned their acceptance with what were anti-Catholic colonists. It was because of their helpful service, their courageous service, their sacrificial service during the Revolution that won for Catholics the respect of their fellow Americans and brought Catholicism right into the center of American life. Just think of how crazy it is that our national capital in Washington, D.C., was land that was donated by Catholic Americans. It's strange to see how the Catholic University of America can be located right smack in the heart of the nation's capital. And it's because of the significant role that Catholics played in the founding of America. So that's another issue to get into. And if you wonder, why do I know so much about this Catholic history of early America, it's because I actually took a course at Harvard last year. And in that course on the forming and the debate of the Constitution, I directed all of my effort to studying those two Catholic men, Daniel Carroll and Thomas Fitzsimmons, and learned as much as I could about the circumstances of Catholic life in early America. I found it very interesting. So anyway, when we look at America, we see this principle of religious freedom that was established in the Constitution, and the reason why it was established was because of the collaboration of the different religious groups in the revolutionary period that made America possible. So we're not asked to abandon our religion. We're not asked to all become Americans spiritually. We're recognized as men and women who hold different religions, different traditions, differences in questions of faith and morals. But we're asked to respect one another, to mind our own business, as it were, to practice our own religion privately. And privately doesn't mean invisibly. It simply means not at public expense, to not try and force it upon other Americans. But we're welcome to come to the table in American political life, as it were, and offer our thoughts, explain the insights that can be drawn from our own faith and morals. Catholics are to act in American political life as Catholics. They're not to water down their faith. They're not to water down their moral life, their moral teaching. They're not to abandon it, but they're to bring it to the table and speak as Catholics while also respecting the rights for all other groups to speak according to their own religious persuasions. That's what freedom of religion really means. Our national tradition of religious freedom permits and encourages all people of faith to bring the insights of their religious traditions to bear on political matters. As Pope Francis affirmed during his visit to the U.S., quote, "Religious liberty by its nature transcends places of worship and the private sphere of individuals and families. Religion itself, the religious dimension, is not a subculture. It is a part of the culture of every people and every nation." So religion is not something that should be excluded from public life. It's not something that we should check at the door, as it were. We shouldn't say, oh, well, we've got some political issues to take care of, so let's set aside our Catholic beliefs and Catholic moral convictions, and let's just put on our red, white, and blue shirts and hats and talk as secular Americans. No, that's not what faithful citizenship means as Catholics. We have to understand the role of the church in American political life. It's not a separation of religion from the state. When we talk about separation of church and state, we're talking about the exclusive right of the church to teach and enforce its own beliefs and rules and moral persuasions in its own congregations. The private freedom to exercise its religion. But when we come together in public, it's to respect the reality that other groups are allowed to do so privately as well. And when we come together, we don't fight to enforce our religious convictions on everyone or to make everyone pay for our religious activities. We seek to serve the common good together, just like the colonists did at the time of the Revolutionary War. We seek to serve the common good together, recognizing our differences, respecting our differences, and leaving our differences for peaceful dialogue and discussion while we work together for the common good. The document goes on and says, if society is to have a future, it must respect the truth of our human dignity and submit to that truth. A society is noble and decent, not least for its support of the pursuit of truth and its adherence to the most basic of truths. So we've got to be a truth-seeking people. And just to show how committed early Americans were to the truth, it's worth noting that the motto at Harvard University is nothing other than veritas, truth. The pursuit of truth is not something that just Christians are interested in. It's also not something simple that Christians should think they're the only people who have the corner on. But the pursuit of truth, we should be honest to acknowledge that there is truth, that there are certain axioms from which all reasoning can begin without any religious presumptions. We can all begin with simple axioms, simple self-evident truths. And if you hear that, self-evident truths, it may sound familiar. Yeah, because that's the language of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And so it's these self-evident truths, these human truths, that are the foundation of political activity, of the common good. We can't have a society that is relativistic and just says there is no truth. Truth is whatever we decide it is, and so on. Man is the measure of all things. No, there is truth. There is truth. However, there is some truth that is only received in light of the grace of faith, and there is other truth that is evident to human observation or human reason alone. And much of what we do in political life is going to be restricted to that which is simply human truth, natural truth, simple observation and reason, what we might even call common sense. And yet at the same time, the insights of faith, the insights of divine revelation, the insights of the experiences of our religious communities need to be brought to the table. The truths, the document goes on to say, the truths that guide public life can be known by natural reason. The truths that guide public life can be known by natural reason. Notice it doesn't say are known, it says can be known. There still is learning and teaching and explaining that needs to be done. But the truths that guide public life, our collaboration, working for the common good, these can be known by natural reason. The sanctity of human life, which was one of the fundamental rights that were named in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, the sanctity of human life, the equal dignity of all individuals, the obligation to protect the vulnerable, the nature and purposes of sex, marriage, and family, these are not exclusively religious truths. And this can be easily proven because much of what the Church teaches, much of what we believe as Catholics with respect to these issues, to the sanctity of human life, to the dignity of all individuals, to the obligation to protect the vulnerable, to the nature and purposes of sex, marriage, and family, these are not positions that Christianity invented. These are positions, these are views that we can go back before the founding of the Christian Church and find in the writings of the great pagan philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras, the Stoics, Cicero, and so on. These truths on which our society is built, these are secular truths. These are truths that can be known by natural reason and which were known by natural reason. And so we have to be careful that we don't allow them to be dismissed as our faith or our religion, because that's not true. These are philosophical principles. These are not religious dogmas. To say that all human life is sacred is not a religious dogma that requires faith. To say that all individuals, all human beings have a common and equal dignity as human beings. To say that we are obliged to protect the vulnerable. And to say that sex, marriage, and family life have clear ends that can be understood by observation and reason alone. These are not religious teachings. For there to be good political life, these truths must be considered as self-evident, as the Founding Fathers said. Now, one of the problems that we have in modern society is that Christian people are not very well educated, and they don't know how to discuss these things reasonably. They don't know how to prove these things reasonably. And so they resort to what I call Sunday school answers, where they act as if these are religious beliefs. They act as if these things are ideas that we received from our Christian religion. And when they do that, when they present things like the sanctity of life or the dignity of all individuals or a true definition of marriage or true use of sexual activity and so on, when they present that as if it's a Christian idea, which many Christians do, they make it very easy for immoral people to dismiss those ideas as a violation of the First Amendment, a violation of the Establishment Clause, to be more specific. And so, again, this is a rhetorical problem where Christians who rush into public discourse, rush into public debate, rush into political controversies, before they've actually learned how to speak of them properly, cause them to appear to be religious teachings and allow them to be easily dismissed as inappropriate for public life. So this is a problem, this is a fault of Christian people who do this because they can only think in terms of religion. They only think in terms of their Bible study or what their church teaches or what they believe and so on. And they don't actually know the natural reasons on which these truths and these good practices are founded. And that's a Christian problem. Part of the problem in public discourse and political action. These are not exclusively religious truths, but truths that all people of goodwill can come to know without the aid of revelation. These are not exclusively religious truths, but truths that all people of goodwill, notice it doesn't say all people, it modifies that and says all people of goodwill. There are people who do not have goodwill. We will never agree with them. But all people of goodwill can come to know these truths and see the truth of them without the aid of divine revelation. Our Catholic faith sheds light on these truths, and so we have a duty to bring that light to our nation. Our Catholic faith sheds light on these truths, and so we have a duty to bring that light which comes from our Catholic faith, to our nation. And there's a quote on the page here in large print that reads, "The truth is something we receive, not something we make. We can only judge using the conscience we have, but our judgments do not make things true." The same is true of our feelings, of our desires, and so on. The truth is something that we receive. The truth is something greater than us, that was before us, that comes from outside of us. It's something that we receive, not something that we make or establish. We observe the truth that's already in the world. And as I said, this can be easily proven because we can go back to a book of ancient philosophy. There's a book called Household Management by a philosopher named Xenophon. And in that book, he teaches how a family functions according to nature. He explains according to nature, based on natural reason alone. He explains what the role of the husband is, what the role of the wife is, how the husband and wife relate to the children, how the labor of the household ought to be divided according to nature, just by observing the differences, the physical differences between a man and a woman. When we look at a woman, we see that her body produces children. Her body also produces nourishment for the children. And because she needs to be provided with a safe environment in which to remain for the sake of producing children, for the sake of nursing and caring for small, vulnerable children, it's natural for her to remain in the hive, as it were, at home. And whereas the man has no such natural relation to the child, he's not the source of the child's nourishment. It's not necessary for him to take it easy through pregnancy or recover after delivery. It's obviously that he's the one who's designed by nature to go out and work for the family and provide that safe, nurturing home for the wife/mother and their children. So those arguments were made not by Christians, those arguments were made by pagans, philosophers who lived 300 years before the Christian church was ever established. The truth is not something we make. It's something that has always been, is observed in the natural world, and our job as human beings is to study and observe the truth and then subject our will to it and live in harmony with the truth that already exists in the world. That's what wisdom is, practically speaking. Living in harmony with nature. This document goes on. The bishops and their pastoral collaborators each have distinct roles in the church's mission. The bishops have the responsibility to govern the society of the church. The bishops have the responsibility to hand on doctrine and tradition. The bishops have the responsibility to administer the sacraments. So 3 duties are listed here. The bishops have the responsibility to govern the society of the church, to hand on doctrine and tradition, and to administer the sacraments. The laity are called to bring the gospel to bear on the world. Think of how we're sent out at the end of Mass. We're sent out. We're sent to go and bring the gospel out to the world. And where do we go? We go back to our homes, back to our neighborhoods, back to our businesses, and so on. We bring the gospel from the church to the world. The laity are called to bring the gospel to bear on the world. While many laity are involved in roles of leadership and service within the church, it remains primarily the role of the laity to advocate for justice, to serve in public office, and to inform daily life with the gospel. As I always quote from the Catechism, to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. It remains primarily the role of the laity to advocate for justice, to serve in public office, and to inform daily life with the gospel. The direct duty to work for a just ordering of society is proper to the lay faithful. Now notice that doesn't say it's the layman's job to go and earn a living. It's the layman's job to go and live in the world. No. It's the layman's job to order society in justice. It's the duty of the laity to direct temporal affairs according to God's will. Not just to go get a job, not just to go to school, not just to go play and enjoy his freedom because, hey, I'm not a priest, I'm not a bishop, I'm not a monk, I'm not a nun. No, that's not what the laity is. The laity has the mission of ordering temporal affairs according to God's will. Participation in political life requires judgments about concrete circumstances. While bishops, together with their co-workers, help form the laity in accordance with basic principles or general principles, they do not tell the laity to vote for particular candidates. On these often complex matters, it is the laity's responsibility to form their own consciences and grow in the virtue of prudence to approach the many and varied issues of the day with the mind of Christ. In other words, those spheres of influence which are uniquely yours and mine, those unique spheres of influence that we have, those unique circumstances, they are our mission field. It's our mission to bring the gospel to bear on those areas of life as laymen that are under our control. That's our specific mission. And you can see how it's individualized. We take the basic principles, the universal teachings of the church that we learn from the bishops, and we bring them down to our unique circumstances. And we direct temporal affairs as far as we're capable of influencing them according to God's will. We bring all things into obedience, as it were, as St. Paul says in the New Testament. Conscience, document goes on, conscience is a judgment of reason by which one determines whether an action is right or wrong. It does not allow us to justify doing whatever we want. We can't just say, "Oh, that I have to act on conscience. That's my conscience." No, that's not necessarily your conscience. That could just be your will, or your feelings, or your preferences, or your biases, and so on. Conscience, properly formed according to God's revelation and the teaching of the Church, is a means by which one listens to God and discerns how to act in accordance with the truth. That's what conscience truly is. The truth is something we receive, not something we make. We can only judge using the conscience we have, but our judgments do not make things true. And I would warn everyone, we all need to be warned, I include myself in this, we all need to be warned to follow a good saying that Benjamin Franklin was famous for when they used to debate all of these issues relating to law and government. Benjamin Franklin used to remind, he was sort of the old wise man among the founding fathers, he used to advise them and say, do not trust in your own infallibility. In other words, realize that you could be wrong. As confident as you may be, you could be wrong on a particular issue. And therefore you ought to doubt your infallibility. We can only judge using the conscience we have, but our judgments do not make things true. And there are many things, I would argue, that Catholics argue and hold in concrete details, in practical applications that are simply not right. And this is part of the problem that we've got to learn to overcome. It is our responsibility to learn more of Catholic teaching and tradition, to participate in church life, to learn from trustworthy sources. Notice, not just from any sources that identify as Catholic, but trustworthy. And by trustworthy, that means deserving of the trust of Catholics. That means faithful to the magisterium. That means faithful to the Pope and bishops. Not just your favorite podcaster, not your favorite maverick, isolated bishop who speaks against the Pope and all the other bishops. How many bishops are there? Thousands, right? 6,000? Am I wrong to think that there are 6,000 bishops in the church? So you find one bishop who shares your opinion, and you start quoting him and pasting his words all over your websites and social media pages because you found one bishop who is a maverick and who is not supported by any of the other bishops. That's not trustworthy sources. The trustworthy source is the 2,000-year-old hierarchy of the Catholic Church. The trustworthy source is the Pope and the bishops in union with the Pope, which is the magisterium. To learn from trustworthy sources about the issues facing our communities. Notice how many times, notice how often, what the bishops say on an issue or what the Pope says on an issue isn't your opinion. What do you do in those situations? If there's a certain situation, certain controversy that you see and face in your life, and you hear the Pope says this about it, and you don't like what the Pope says, or the bishops say this about it, and you don't like what the bishops say, you trust your judgment and despise the judgment of the Pope and bishops? Remember what we just read there. We judge using the conscience we have, but our judgments do not make things true. We could be wrong. And for those of you who consider yourselves trad Catholics and you think it's cool to speak against popes and bishops, I recommend that you go back and study the Baltimore Catechism, which trad Catholics claim to love so much, but I don't think they study it. Go and study the 4th book of the Baltimore Catechism, where the Catechism speaks on the fallibility and infallibility of the Pope. I recommend you read that section of Book 4 of the Baltimore Catechism. And you're going to realize that what was taught in the 1880s in the Church directly contradicts what is commonly said by many so-called trad Catholics complaining about the Second Vatican Council. Go read it. It is our responsibility to learn more of Catholic teaching and tradition, to participate in church life, to learn from trustworthy sources about the issues facing our communities, and to do our best to make wise judgments about candidates and government actions. These decisions should take into account a candidate's commitments, character, integrity, and ability to influence a given issue. Let me read those again. These decisions should take into account a candidate's commitments, character, integrity, and, I want to underscore this last one, ability to influence a given issue. The reason why that last one is especially significant is because during election seasons, politicians make many promises. They make many promises that intelligent people who understand how our government works know this candidate cannot actually bring to pass. So you can have a presidential candidate say, if you elect me, I am going to do this, and everyone can get all excited about it. But anyone who understands how our government actually works, the three divisions of the government, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, how they work with checks and balances, someone who understands how the government actually works will know that the president can't actually do this or that and fulfill this or that promise unless the Congress also supports it. And so if we've got a Congress that we know is not going to support a certain idea or a certain action that's promised by a presidential candidate, that candidate is making unrealistic, irresponsible campaign promises to get elected that he doesn't actually have the ability to fulfill. And both parties do this. The Republican Party does this, and the Democratic Party does this. They both make promises to their voting bases that everyone in the American government knows they cannot possibly carry out. And so the church warns us that we should take into account a candidate's commitments, character, integrity, and ability to influence a given issue. Thus equipped and further impelled by our sense of patriotism, which is good, we exercise our right and duty to vote and otherwise to participate actively in public life. By forming our consciences for faithful citizenship, we can better pursue the common good and thus obey the command of our Lord to love our neighbors. So this duty of faithful citizenship can be understood as being tied directly to the command to love our neighbor as ourself. One of the important lessons that we learned in our lay Dominican formation was that the Christian life starts with the love of God, and the love of God is manifested by our study of divine revelation, by our contemplation and prayer, by which we devote ourselves in love to God. And that contemplative life, that devotional life, that life of love for God wells up within us and overflows. And the overflow of that love for God is the love with which we serve our neighbor. We don't serve our neighbor for his own sake. We don't serve our neighbor because our neighbor is good or deserves it. We serve our neighbor because we love God. And it pleases God and glorifies God for us to serve our neighbor. Pursuing the common good makes us like God. And so everything is actually motivated not by the merits or the value even of our neighbor, but simply by the love of God. And so to love our neighbor, not for his own sake, but for God's sake, is really the motive of our political action. And if we love God as we should, we will feel impelled. Like St. Paul says about preaching the gospel, he says the love of Christ constrains us. We can't not do this. We must do this because we love God. We can't stand to see a world in which God's will is not done, and yet at the same time we know that God tells us that his will is to be preached and left to human freedom of will. And so it's not something we're not to go out like crusaders and start rounding people up and executing people. And I'm not condemning the Crusades. The Crusades are an example of Christian faith applied to different circumstances. But it's the love of God that ultimately motivates us to love our neighbor, to seek the common good, and want to create a beautiful, just, peaceful, well-ordered society that glorifies God, that allows men to see the goodness of God in the natural world and in human society, all of which brings glory to God. Notice also it doesn't say following our consciences. It says by forming our consciences. Not by following our consciences as if we're all right, we've got it all, we know all the answers, we just have to do what we feel, what our gut tells us. No, it doesn't teach that. It says by forming our consciences, we can better pursue the common good and thus obey the command of our Lord to love our neighbors. And so this question of political action is really a question of what it means to love our neighbor. And we can distinguish between good political action and bad political action by whether or not we're acting out of love for God and love for our neighbor, or whether we're just fighting for our own stuff. It's like when people ask, is it okay for me to shoot someone who breaks into my house? What are you actually asking? What are you actually asking in that question? And how would a Christian person whose life is devoted to the love of God and to the love of his neighbor, how would a Christian person be led to sit around wondering if he could shoot his neighbor if he breaks into his house? You can see that we're already down a bad road, and much of the political discourse is of this nature. The questions are not even appropriate for Christian people. We're responsible for our neighbor. You know, the question that Cain asked, am I my brother's keeper? The answer is yes. And so when people oppose us and act contrary to our beliefs or our desired practices, we don't have the right to just round them up in prison and kill them, or to penalize and sanction them politically. Our ultimate responsibility, which is more important than our political responsibilities, our ultimate responsibility is to go into the world and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that Christ commands. And if our political action is actually undermining the Great Commission, which is our ultimate mission, well, then our political action is evil. And so we've got to start with the Great Commission and ask whether our political action is flowing from the Great Commission, and whether it's always operating in harmony with the principles of the gospel and of the Great Commission, which Christ himself modeled for us and taught us. So that's all for this second document published by the bishops. The title again of this document was The Role of the Church in American Political Life. That's the second document in this series on forming consciences for faithful citizenship, which was published by the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops. So this is the second talk on the topic, part 2 of this series, and I'll try to continue day by day to go through the next 3 or 4 of these and finish this series so we can have this all done as early in the election season as possible, so we have time to listen to it, read these documents, chew on it, talk about it, and so on, and hopefully by November be able to participate responsibly and faithfully in the upcoming election. I hope that's helpful. God bless.